Hello, my fellow developers. This is the latest installment of the Advanced Framework, the version 4.0. The framework contains a lot of new features, and we plan to release a huge number of video tutorials. In this video, I will just be going over the project structure and how to get the most basic level set up running. So, let us dive right in. Here we have a freshly installed advanced framework from the Unreal Marketplace. We have our content folder with the advanced framework core inside. And if you take a look inside, we have our basic level structure. We have our animations folder, which contain all the animations. We have a animation blueprint folder, which contains all the animation blueprints. We have the blueprint folder, which contains all the logic. I will go into that shortly. Then we have our curves, which are basically just mathematical curves. Data assets. Data assets I should explain a bit more closely. Data assets are a new concept of creating kind of templates and then having like different presets of these templates. So we can create a template, for example, the PDA controller VR, and from that template we can create our different presets, and then we can use these files as like summaries of configurations. And we use that actually quite often, for example, for our palettes and levels and gestures and AR configuration. And yeah, you will see them being used in future videos quite a bit. So we changed to this data asset concept where we try to have preset data that shouldn't be changed during runtime collected in data assets. And then we have data tables. Data tables basically are handling our internationalization. So you have your translations. You can find them in the data table. There are a few examples of translations, and we will also handle how to do translations in a later video. You have enums, which is a very basic concept to Unreal programming. And then examples, I will go into the example folder shortly. We have our fonts, we have our blueprint interfaces, we have our libraries. Libraries are basically just functions and macros that are universally accessible from any blueprint. So basically, these are just utility functions or universally accessible functions, and they're all being placed in these files. Then you have your maps folder. Your maps folder is basically very empty. Remember that in a framework, you want to be creating your own maps with your own content, and the framework doesn't provide any real maps with them. Obviously, there are example maps, but these are being found in the example folder. Then you have a few materials, also very basic a few materials that the framework needs. It's just for the highlighting, the teleport grid, for example, a few base colors, and yeah, progress bar and context shadow and elements like that. Then you have a few meshes, environment mesh, which is basically sky sphere, a few pawn meshes covering the avatar, the motion controllers, the hand controllers, the mannequin, a few UI meshes for the laser, the mini tag, the radio menu, the palette, and elements like that. Just a few meshes that belong to the framework. And then you also have utility meshes. And you have the movies folder. Unreal basically wants you to put all your movies inside a movies folder. And remember, there are also movies in the framework, and it's a basic Unreal way of integrating movies, which contains quite a lot of folders, and it's a bit of a hassle to do. But there are a lot of good tutorials on how to integrate movies or MP4s into your source. Remember, our movies that we are using are not in the content folder because they're being streamed online, and you can basically see inside the TV and see how that works. Then we have the sounds folder, sounds continuing of sound attenuation classes, cues, and waves. This is basically how sound should be divided inside an Unreal project. And yeah, the framework also uses quite a bit of waves. I know they don't sound perfectly, and I would recommend you to change them and with your own kind of sound cues. Then we have our structs folder, again, a very basic Unreal concept of using structs. and you find all the structs that are being used inside the project in this folder. And the same accounts for the textures. You have all the textures, which are just a very few for example, for the controllers or for head elements or logos. You can find them inside the texture folder. So since this is basically the advanced framework is a coding framework, so we expect most of the elements to be in the blueprints folder, and this is where we basically find the heart and core of the framework. And it starts with the components. The components are a very, very essential and critical part to the framework, since it's basically all move to a component-based system. So all of the functionality is normally triggered or being executed or um, uh, defined by a component. And we have 7 categories of components: the interaction component, miscellaneous component, multiplayer component, pawn component, snapping component, state component, UI component, and inside these folders we have a ton of components each. And basically each of these components need their own video tutorial on how to use them, and we are going to create most tutorials for most of them. So don't be alarmed. Most of these components are quite easy to use, but you'll be interacting with components a lot. Then you have edge scripting widgets, which are not really in use. Then heart and core of the framework is the game folder, which are basically the Unreal classes. You have the game instance class and the game mode class, and the game mode class defines all the other classes: the game state class, player control class, player state class, camera manager class, game HUD class. It's very important that the game instance and the game mode class are being set inside the project settings. And normally you don't want to change them much. You do have to go inside one of like the game instance class or the player controller class a few times if you want to change, for example, which pawn is being spawned or which platform you want to build on. You may want to do this in the game instance class, but I explain how you will do that when it arrives. So you may want to interact with these classes a bit, but not too much. Helpers classes you generally do not want to touch. These are mostly assisting other actors, for example, components, to be executing their tasks. So they will be spawning them automatically and be removing them automatically, and you don't want to touch them at all. So helper is usually a sign, okay, this is going to assist another class doing something. And you don't need to, these cannot exist by themselves. They need something else to exist inside. The next folder is the level folder, and there we have most actors that we want to place in the scene. So for example, we have the map info actor, which we can also find over here, is being placed. We have a pause actor, which we will find when we want to press a pause button. A player position, which we can, for example, find over here. We also want to place that. Post-process actor, this is actually being automatically spawned when post-process is needed, but you can also place them in the world. Then you have a sky sphere, you have a few teleport actors, for example, a teleport mesh or a teleport area. It's also being explained in the teleport video. And then transition actors, which will help in the transition. Manager, another concept of basically a manager tries to orchestrate or coordinate different actors. So different actors will use them automatically or will create them automatically if they want to be orchestrated. And so a manager basically allows the communication between different actors. So if you have like 4 or 5 different actors which need to kind of synchronize between each other, they would normally create a manager to do that. Then you have a pawn class. Pawns, again, a very, very important essential class. This is basically the class that, or is the character that you will be controlling. And the pawn base is the parent class of them all, and all of the other pawns derive from that. And we have 4 categories of pawns, which is asymmetric pawn, desktop pawn, mobile pawn, and VR pawn. And how to set each up will each individual will get a individual video tutorial, because setting them up, while it's not difficult, it's also like there should be a bit of explanation for each of them. So expect a video tutorial on how to set each of these pawns up. Then you have UI elements. UI elements are basically all of the UI elements that you can see in the world. And there we have the info windows, palettes, panels, progress bar, radio, buttons, selection, tags, tiny display, and utilities, which are basically all the user interfaces that the framework comes bundled with. Obviously, you can create your own. These basically also only use widgets and components to be using that widget. And it's just a preset preset kind of user interfaces that the framework comes bundled with. And I think they fit to a huge variety of use cases. So you mostly in most applications, it should be enough just using these kind of interfaces to be displaying your information inside the world. Utilities are basically just a random miscellaneous actors that serve certain purposes. Some of them maybe will be getting a video tutorial, but they're really not essential to the core functionality. So these are basically just utility actors that serve certain purposes. A very important folder again is a VR folder, which has two subfolders, the motion components and the motion controllers. When we explain how to set up the VR pawn, we will also explain how to set up the motion controllers and the motion components, because this is a very, very core and important concept, and it should be explained in depth. Widgets, the framework has its own widget system, but these are basically normal widgets as you would expect in any Unreal application. These mostly serve the UI elements, so you also see the parallels, you have the palettes, the panels, the tags, the tiny display, and you also find these UI elements over here. And additionally, you also have the HUD for the desktop pawn, and these are basically the widgets that I initially packed. But for each application, widgets are a very unique thing, and you often want to implement your own widgets for your own application. Okay, so this was a blueprints folder, and now we come to the last folder. Let me close up firstly. The example folder. The example folder is kind of special because it contains all the example content. So all of the example maps, for example, this grabbing map over here, has a lot of stuff in it, and you don't want to have that in your final project. So we designed the project in a way that you can basically just hit delete on the entire example project, just like that. And obviously it will take just a second, but you will see that it has no references to the rest of the project. So you can safely delete it without losing any functionality or anything related. But what remains is just the core of the framework, which is going to be an extremely slim and very very essential package to just the functionality that you want. So in order to create a really clean application, you do want to always delete the example folders, because the example folders are just for you to learn on how to use certain elements, but you don't want to be using them in your final project. You obviously want to create your own, or just take them as examples and maybe move them out into your own project. So remember, you always want to end up deleting the example folder, and then you will cut down on 2/3 of the size of the whole project. Okay, so this was all on the project setup that I wanted to explain. And lastly, I want to set up a simple level. So we have done something constructive in this round. So let us quickly see how we can do that. So to set up our level, let us create a new level by setting up new level and hit default. And I will place that level in a new folder. I think this is very important to start a new folder structure for each of your projects, because placing everything in the core folder is going to be where all your Unreal packages are going to end up as well. And it's normally a whole mess inside the core folder. So you want to have everything concerning your folder in a subfolder. So I will call this tutorial. And actually I will go in there and have another folder called maps. And I will save this in there, calling it map tutorial. That's it. Okay, basically we don't need much to start a level. There's already something in here, but it's very important that we remove the player start that comes shipped with Unreal. We need our own player start from the framework, and we can find that being called player position. You can search for that in the framework, or you have that under blueprints level player position. You can basically place that in the world, and then you have your player position. A second thing that we need, and this already explains a bit about the concept of data assets, we need some information about the level, and basically you need a level data asset for every level that you want to create. So we're going to create another folder called data assets, and inside here we create another folder called level. And remember that I talked about the presets, and we have a level preset, and this is called PDA level. So what we can do inside our data asset level folder, we can create ourselves a new data structure, and use the template of PDA level. And we are going to call that a DA tutorial level. So DA standing for data asset tutorial level. And if we go inside here, we can see that we want to set a few parameters. So what is important for now is we want to set the pawn types, or else the application doesn't know which pawn is supposed to be spawning. Remember, I'm going to do a video tutorial on each of these pawn types and how to set them up. So for now, we'll just take the most generic pawn type that we have, and this is going to be the pawn desktop char, for example. We want to set a default a VR pawn as well, which is also going to be the pawn VR char, standing for character. And for mobile, we also want a generic one, which is the pawn mobile char. Okay, and now we need to assign this data asset to this level. This needs to be done by placing a map info actor inside the world and assigning this map info actor the data asset that we just created, the data asset tutorial level. And now this level is being assigned this data asset, and if we hit play, he will create our character. It even has this kind of character mesh, and it has a shadow, and we can already move and have the most basic functionalities that a character can do. And this is basically all you need to do to set up a very, very basic level. And most of the functionality will then be added through, for example, components or through actors or through elements from other ways. But this is, if you want to just dive into a level, place a player position inside the level, assign it a level key, so you have certain information. And this is basically all you need to know. If we take a quick look inside the data asset again, it had a bit more information about the transition and level streaming. I will explain that in another video. And obviously, as I said, each of these desktop pawns, I will I will have another video on how to set up your own specific pawn, specific for your application's needs. So all of these pawns, especially the VR pawn, they need a bit of love on how to configure them and how to set them up to do exactly what you want them to do. Okay, so this is all I wanted to explain in this video. I hope that for all of your projects, you will be adapting this kind of level structure that I introduced. I find it after many years of development that this is actually the best one, because most of the projects that I had the luxury of working in for others, they ended up having like a very, very messy level structures, because most of it just ends up being being trashed in the in the content folder, and since all of the asset packs that you download also end up in here, you really want a subfolder, and you want to keep your level structure coherent and clean. Okay, so this is all I wanted to say for this video, and there are a lot of videos to come, and I hope I will see you in the next ones.